This is Limelight America. Here's your host, Michael Drew Shaw.
Thank you, Lynette, and welcome to Limelight America, where we present one-on-one personal conversations with interesting people from all walks of life. These up-close encounters with people of the fascinating and inspiring kind include business, entertainment, sports, and artistic entrepreneurs, scholars, role models, and philanthropists who impact the quality of life for us all. The history of the modern computer industry is rife with pioneering duos, including William Hewlett and David Packard, Bill Gates, and Paul Allen. But the duo that is most responsible for making personal computers as common a consumer durable as television sets is Andrew Grove and Gordon Moore. These innovative entrepreneurs provided the ammunition for the personal computer revolution and built one of the most profitable businesses in the annals of history. Born in Pescadero, California, a tiny coastal town about 50 miles north of San Francisco, Gordon Moore never dreamed he'd become an entrepreneur. He wanted to pursue the quiet, contemplative life of academia. But after graduating from the California Institute of Technology with a PhD in chemistry and physics, he found that teaching jobs were scarce, and he accepted a position with Shockley Semiconductor, a research lab founded by Nobel Prize winner and co-inventor of the transistor, William Shockley. At Shockley, Moore met and became friends with another engineer, Robert Noyce. William Shockley may have been a brilliant scientist, but he proved to be a merciless manager and virtually impossible to work for. After a year of frustration, Moore, Noyce, and 6 other engineers left Shockley and started Fairchild Semiconductor, a West Coast subsidiary of Fairchild Camera and Instrument. Together, this close-knit group developed the first integrated circuit, which combined several electronic components onto a single chip, rather than devoting a separate chip to each function. As Moore would later recall, "We had no idea that we had turned the first stone on something that was going to be a billion-dollar business." During his time at Fairchild, Moore interviewed and hired his future partner, Andrew Grove. A Holocaust survivor, Grove had immigrated to the United States in 1957 when the Soviet Union invaded his homeland of Hungary. Grove arrived in New York City with $20 in his pocket and little knowledge of the English language. He enrolled in the City College of New York, a free school that had become kind of an immigrant's Oxford. He studied engineering. Overcoming the language barrier, Grove received his bachelor's degree, graduating near the top of his class. From there, he headed to California, where he entered the PhD program at the University of California, Berkeley. Again, he was an academic star, and upon graduation in 1963, he had his pick of American research corporations. He narrowed his choices down to Bell Laboratories or Fairchild Semiconductors, and finally chose to cast his lot with Fairchild. For the next 5 years, Grove would work side by side with Moore, who became his mentor and friend. At Fairchild, Grove was a member of the team that perfected the use of silicon in transistors, which set the stage for the semiconductor revolution. But while Grove and his team were revolutionizing the semiconductor industry, Fairchild was falling apart. Engineers were leaving, top executives didn't understand the business, and science was being replaced by politics. Sensing Fairchild was doomed, Robert Noyce and Gordon Moore decided to start their own company. Knowing Grove's excellent organizational, communication, and leadership skills, they asked him to join them. Backed with money provided by San Francisco venture capitalist Arthur Rock, the trio founded Intel, short for Integrated Electronics Corporation. That was in 1968. With Noyce as CEO, Moore as Executive Vice President, and Grove as Director of Operations, Intel produced its first product, a bipolar memory chip. That was in 1969. From the beginning, Intel adopted what Moore calls the Goldilocks strategy. Intel's execs knew they had a choice of 3 technologies: an easy one that could be quickly copied by the competition, a complicated one that might easily bankrupt them, or a moderately complicated one. Like Goldilocks, they chose the middle course, a decision that would eventually enable Intel to dominate the microchip market. Intel's first big product, The 1101 static RAM chip gave the company a strong lead on its competitors, a lead it maintained for nearly 10 years. In the early 1970s, Intel reached beyond the memory chip market and began experimenting with multi-purpose chips, using software to make one chip perform multiple functions. It was this research that led Intel to produce the world's first microprocessor, a single chip powerful enough to run a small computer. That was in 1971. Ironically, Grove and most other Intel execs did not think of it as part of the company's core business. Nevertheless, Intel continued to refine its microprocessors. Intel experienced tremendous growth throughout the 1970s, dominating the memory chip market and increasing its earnings with each fiscal year. Moore succeeded Noyce as CEO in 1979, and Grove became the company's president. 2 years later, IBM chose Intel's 8086 microprocessor for its fledgling personal computer. It couldn't have happened at a better time. Japanese semiconductor companies had begun dumping cheap memory chips into the U.S. market and were rapidly eating away at Intel's profits. The crisis forced Grove to reassess the value of the microprocessor. In 1984, he and Moore suggested that Intel shift its focus from memory chips to microprocessors. This proposal would change the course of Intel's history. IBM's decision to use only Intel chips in its computers had already given Intel a tremendous lead in the microprocessor market. In addition, IBM had purchased $400 million of Intel stock, which provided Intel with the capital it needed to design and construct new microprocessor plants. By 1985, personal computer sales were booming as IBM clones poured into the market at record pace. But while cloners such as compact computers were rapidly swiping market shares from IBM, nearly all of them had to use Intel's chips, which had become the industry standard. With the huge and growing market assured by IBM as well as the cloners, Intel quickly became the world's largest producer of microprocessors. In 1987, Moore retired, handing the title of CEO over to Grove. Under Grove's guidance, Intel produced increasingly powerful microprocessors throughout the 1990s, achieving near monopoly conditions in supplying chips for PCs. In fact, Intel experienced little or no competition until the close of the decade. As the popularity of PCs grew, competition in the market became fierce. A number of computer companies began using cheaper chips from other manufacturers in order to offer consumer PCs priced under $1,000. Unwilling to walk away from a market whose size Grove predicted is going to be measured in tens of millions of units per year, maybe bigger, Intel began producing chips for value PCs. That was in 1997. Once again, Grove was able to keep Intel on top. By the end of 97, Intel held nearly 90% of the microprocessor market, with sales exceeding $25 billion. Grove remained the chairman of the board until May 2005, the last of the original three founders. Even then, the 68-year-old couldn't completely wash his hands of his company, however, staying on as a senior advisor to the company's management and directors. His involvement seems to still be paying off. In 2004, the company brought in $34 billion in revenue, and it looked like 2005 would see even higher numbers. So Grove's advice appears as reliable as the computer chip he helped create. Oh, and we have a footnote on this one. If nothing else, Andrew Grove is a survivor. His one major mistake actually turned into a boon for the company. In 1994, Intel released millions of flawed Pentium computer chips. Consumers demanded replacements, but Grove refused. He insisted the glitch was so small that conventional PC users would not be affected unless they were working on some kind of advanced astrophysics problem. Dissatisfied with this response, Pentium users turned to the press, and Grove had a public relations nightmare on his hands. Within a few days, he reversed his decision and agreed to spend $475 million to replace the chips, going so far as to offer home delivery. Grove would later admit that that incident was a difficult education in customer relations. Ironically, Grove's decision turned a PR disaster into an advertising bonanza. The extensive press coverage made Intel's name better known than ever.
You're listening to Limelight America.
Well-dressed men in the 1900s had to endure the discomfort of shirts with heavily starched, separate collars with the roominess of a straitjacket. They prevented undignified wrinkles, but they were a pain in the neck in the truest sense. A New York entrepreneur who was tired of the rash around his neck from the starch around his collar came up with a shirt with a semi-soft attached collar strong enough to hold its shape without starch. The new design was introduced in 1919, and as you can imagine, it was an immediate success, thus making John Van Heusen the proud owner of the $1 million collar.
Good taste is good business. Joyce Claude Hall.
When 18-year-old Joyce Claude Hall stepped off a train in Kansas City, Missouri in 1910, he didn't have much. Just a battered suitcase and 2 shoeboxes of picture postcards. Full of youthful enthusiasm, J.C., as he preferred to be called, was determined to make his mark on the business world. He had big plans, and he had the energy, too, to make them happen. And happen they would over the next 56 years. Hall would create a new industry and build the world's largest greeting card company. Hall's early life was marked by a nearly constant struggle to overcome abject poverty. His father, an itinerant preacher, abandoned his family, leaving Hall and his 2 older brothers to provide for their semi-invalid mother. He took his first job as a farmhand when he was 8, and a year later he was selling cosmetics and soap door to door for the California Perfume Company, which later became Avon, by the way. In 1902, Hall's older brothers moved to Norfolk, Nebraska, and opened a bookstore. Not long after, the rest of the family joined them, and Hall went to work in the store for $18 a month. Believing there was a large local market for postcards imported from Europe, Hall and his brothers established Norfolk Postcard Company. Unfortunately, there wasn't enough local demand to keep the company in business. Realizing there might be a larger market for postcards outside Norfolk, Hall quit school, packed 2 shoeboxes full of postcards, and headed for Kansas City. When he arrived, he had only enough money to rent a small room at the YMCA, which served as home, office, and stockroom for the next year. He sent out packets of 100 postcards to dealers throughout the Midwest in hopes of starting a small mail-order business. Some of the dealers kept the cards without paying. Others returned the unsolicited merchandise with angry notes, but about 1/3 of the dealers sent the young entrepreneur a check. In just a few months, he'd earned $200. Despite his initial success, Hall believed illustrated postcards were a passing fad, so he added a line of imported Christmas and Valentine's Day cards. Within a year, his brother Raleigh joined him in the business, and by 1912, the Hall brothers' logo started appearing on greeting cards. J.C. and Raleigh further expanded their line and opened retail stores in Kansas City and Chicago. Just when success seemed to be within the brothers' grasp, disaster struck. In 1915, just a few weeks before Valentine's Day, fire swept through their warehouse, destroying their entire inventory of Valentine's Day cards and leaving the brothers $17,000 in debt. "If you want to quit, that was a good time to quit," said Hall. "But if you're not a quitter, you begin to think fast." And that's exactly what he did. Rising to the challenge, Hall borrowed enough money to purchase a local engraving firm so he and Raleigh could replenish their stock quickly and cheaply by printing their own cards. They produced their first 2 cards in time for Christmas 1915. The hand-painted Yuletide greetings quickly became a success with holiday shoppers, providing the brothers with a badly needed influx of cash. Now that he had his own printing press and some capital to work with, Hall began experimenting with other card concepts. At the time, most of the greeting cards sold in the U.S. were elaborately engraved imports from England and Germany, made only for Christmas and Valentine's Day. But Hall believed Americans, who were much more casual than Europeans, would take to the idea of inexpensive, everyday greeting cards they could send to friends and family, not just on holidays, but throughout the entire year. His vision of colorfully illustrated cards expressing sentiments, friendship, and even sympathy would create an entirely new market for greeting cards in America. Convinced that the sending of casual me-to-you messages would eventually catch on as a social custom, Hall introduced his first everyday card in 1919. It featured a line from American poet Edgar Guest. It said, "I'd like to be the kind of friend you've been to me." This simple yet heartfelt verse captured a feeling that many people wanted to share, and it became an immediate bestseller. Encouraged by the success of this initial venture, the Hall brothers expanded their card themes to include birthday wishes, anniversary tidings, inspirational greetings, and get-well messages. World War I added to the brothers' success, as folks back home rushed to send missing you cards to loved ones stationed overseas. By the early 1920s, the all-occasion cards were being sold in stores throughout the East and Midwest, and the Halls moved to a new Kansas City location that employed 120 workers. By now, sending me-to-you cards had indeed become a social custom, something which did not go unnoticed by the Hall's main competitor, American Greetings, which had also begun selling all-occasion cards. In response to the increased competition, and to further expand and gain national recognition, Hall rechristened the company Hallmark, a name that suggested only the highest quality. In the decades that followed, Hall continued to strive to make the Hallmark name synonymous with excellence. In 1944, Hallmark executive C.E. Goodman coined the now legendary Hallmark advertising slogan, "When you care enough to send the very best." To ensure his cards lived up to this promise, Hall called upon the talents of popular artists and writers of the day, such as Norman Rockwell, Grandma Moses, Ogden Nash, and Pearl Buck. He even sold cards designed by Winston Churchill and Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis. Always looking for new ways to sell his cards, Hall began studying American shopping habits and discovered a large potential market selling cards through chain drug, food, and discount retailers. In 1959, he introduced Ambassador Cards, a special line created to be sold solely through these rapidly growing retail channels. A die-hard autocrat and staunch perfectionist, Hall insisted on giving his stamp of approval to every single greeting card design and verse before it was added to the product line. Even after his retirement in 1966, when his son Donald took over the helm, Hall continued to put in full days at the office when he wasn't vacationing. At the time of his death in 1982, the company he founded more than 70 years earlier was turning out 8 million greeting cards every day, including the card that started it all, the Edgar Guest Friendship Verse, which remains one of Hallmark's strongest sellers to this day. P.S. Americans spend nearly $8 billion on greeting cards every year. Hallmark leads the industry with more than 41% of the market share.
You're listening to Limelight America.
We're talking with Thaddeus Warrow, the author of Radicals and Visionaries. I have to believe you have a couple of favorites.
Growing up seeing I Love Lucy, I always considered Lucy to be a brilliant comedian and Desi just her straight man. Desi was not only an excellent businessman, but he was quite an innovator.
All right, you build companies to sell them. I started out with Chongqing Chinese Foods in 1944, and I sold to R.J. Reynolds Tobacco for $63 million in '67. I have 7 banks because I had to put the money somewhere.
100 or so years ago, when you needed paint, you had to buy the ingredients separately, measure them out, and mix them for yourself. But that was about to change in 1873, thanks to an accidental meeting between 2 young entrepreneurs from Ohio. One was a paint salesman from Cleveland, the other was in the glass business in Kent. Both in their 20s and restless, they shared an ambition to do something bigger and decided to take a chance on a ready-mixed paint, offering a then unheard-of money-back guarantee. In 1905, the company's now famous Cover the Earth trademark was adopted, even though they weren't exporting anything at the time. Those 2 Ohioans were Henry Alden Sherwin and Edward Porter Williams. Cans have been around for a long time. Now made of lightweight aluminum, the original tin can was born around 200 years ago. Exactly when, nobody seems to know for sure. In 1869, a Philadelphia produce agent who was convinced there was a bright future for canned foods, bought into a Camden cannery and started packing little tins with mincemeat. By 1898, the entrepreneur from Philly had bought out his partner, developed a new product line, and introduced the now familiar red and white label inspired by Cornell's football uniforms. He believed it then, and they're still saying it today. Joseph Campbell's soup is good food.
You're listening to Limelight America.
Part P.T. Barnum, part Billy Graham, Sam Walton single-handedly built Walmart into the biggest retailer in the world, transforming the way America shopped and making himself one of the world's richest men in the process. Thanks to his aw shucks demeanor and his strategy of targeting rural areas, retailing giants like Kmart, Sears, and Woolworths never saw the scrappy, pickup-driving country boy coming. And when they did, it was too late to stop him. Walton began what would be a lifelong career in the retail business in 1940 when he took a job as a sales trainee at J.C. Penney in Des Moines, Iowa. Walton was enthusiastic about his job, but he was never one of Penney's most thorough employees. He hated to make customers wait while he fussed with paperwork, so his books were a mess. His boss even threatened to fire him, saying he was not cut out for retail work. Walton was saved by his ability as a salesman, and he added about $25 per month in commissions to his beginner's salary. Drafted into the United States Army in 1942, Walton served stateside as a communications officer in the Army Intelligence Corps for the duration of the war. By the time he was released from the military in 1945, Walton had a wife and child to support, so he decided to strike out on his own. Putting up $5,000 of his own money and $20,000 that he borrowed from his father-in-law, at the age of 27, Walton purchased a Ben Franklin variety store in Newport, Arkansas. Through hard work and a policy of pricing products well below what other retailers charged, Walton soon tripled his business, and by 1950 he owned the leading Ben Franklin store in the 6-state region. The store's success wasn't lost on Walton's landlord, who decided to acquire the business for his son. Sam had no intention of selling, so the landlord simply refused to renew his lease. The experience would have caused most people to give up, but not Sam Walton. He searched the rural towns of Arkansas for a new place to do business and found it in the tiny community of Bentonville. There, he set up shop in a store on the town square, this time insisting on a 99-year lease. Walton opened Walton's Five and Dime in the summer of 1950. There were 2 other variety stores in town, but neither offered the consistently low prices that Walton did. As a result, the new enterprise quickly achieved the same success of his previous venture, prompting Walton to look for other such opportunities. Maybe it was just my itch to do more business, he would later muse, and maybe, too, I didn't want all my eggs in one basket. Throughout the 1950s, using borrowed money and the profits from stores he already owned, Walton acquired one variety store after another. By 1960, he was the proud owner of 15 stores, but he wasn't seeing the profits he'd expected and thought he ought to be making more money for the kind of effort he was putting in. He decided to adopt a new strategy: discounting, dramatically cutting prices in hopes of undercutting his competition and making up the difference in price through a higher volume of sales. The practice wasn't exactly new, but at the time, discount stores tended to be small, to be located in cities, and to only discount specialty items. Walton's idea was to build big stores that discounted everything they stocked and to place them in small towns. Initially, he approached the company that franchised Ben Franklin stores with his idea, but the company directors loudly refused to back him when Walton explained that they would have to cut their standard wholesale margin in half to accommodate the low prices he intended to charge. So Walton decided to take the gamble himself. Mortgaging his home and borrowing to the hilt, he opened his first Walmart, short for Walton Mart, in 1962 in Rogers, Arkansas, not far from Bentonville. Walton wasn't alone in his venture into discounting. That same year, S.S. Kresge launched Kmart, and Woolworth started Woolco, both of which could have easily crushed Walmart. But Walton was too far off the beaten path to attract the attention of these retail giants. Thrilled that big city discounting had come to small town America, rural customers flocked to Walton stores and sales soared. This early success provided funding for further expansion, and by 1969 there were 18 Walmarts throughout Arkansas and Missouri. Until that time, Walton had funded expansion from profits and borrowing, but in 1970 he decided to take the company public. The initial offering generated nearly $5 million, and although Walton and his family retained 61% ownership of the stock, the proceeds allowed him to pay off the company's debts and move forward with his ambitious expansion plans. In the first year after going public, Walmart added 6 stores, followed by 13 stores in each of the next 2 years, then 14, then 26. By the end of 1980, Walton had 276 stores and would soon be opening stores at the rate of about 100 per year. In 1983, Walton launched the first of his Sam's Wholesale Clubs, which were aimed at small business owners and others who wished to buy merchandise in bulk. Once again, Walton had struck gold. In 1985, Forbes magazine pronounced him the richest man in America, with an estimated worth of $2.8 billion. By 1987, Walmart had become the 3rd largest retailer in the United States, trailing only Sears and Kmart. His retail success in the bag, Walton announced in 1988 that he was handing over the duties of CEO to Walmart executive David Glass, but said he would continue to serve as chairman of the company. 2 years later, Walton was diagnosed with an aggressive strain of bone cancer, but even this dire pronouncement could not dampen his competitive spirit. At Walmart's annual meeting in June 1990, Walton predicted that the company's revenue would quintuple to $125 billion within the next decade. And over the next 2 years, Walmart soared past Kmart and Sears to become the nation's largest retailer. On March 17, 1992, President George Bush presented Walton with the Medal of Freedom for his entrepreneurial spirit and his concern for employees and community. It would be his last and perhaps greatest achievement. A few days later, Walton checked into the University of Arkansas Hospital and passed away on April 5, 1992, 6 days after his 74th birthday. At the time of his death, he had a net worth of nearly $25 billion. Sam Walton didn't invent retailing, just like Henry Ford didn't invent the automobile. But just as Ford's assembly line revolutionized American industry, Walton's pursuit of discounting revolutionized America's service economy. Walton didn't merely alter the way America shopped. He changed the philosophy of the American retail business establishment, instigating the shift of power from manufacturer to consumer that has become prevalent in industry after industry. His pioneering concepts paved the way for a new breed of category retailer, the Home Depots, Barnes & Nobles, and Blockbusters of the world, and forever changed the face of retailing. Oh, and one last word. What do the Pentagon and Walmart have in common? An essential ingredient in Walmart's success was its rapid adoption of the latest technology. Almost from the beginning, Sam Walton recognized that the key to keeping costs down and profits up was tight inventory control, ordering just the right items in just the right amounts. Too much inventory meant undue expense, too little meant lost sales. Finding a way to keep track of what was selling, what was in the stores, what was on order, and what was on back order became one of Walton's obsessions. As a result, Walmart was one of the first major retail chains to install electronic scanners at cash registers, linked to a central inventory control computer. Today, Walmart's computer database capacity is second only to the Pentagon's.
Limelight America is produced by the LA Radio Network.